Melissa Rooney never thought buying shoes could feel dangerous. But as she walked out of Polaris Fashion Place, she couldn't stop smiling, or laughing, or slightly panicking. 3 shopping bags hung from each arm. Another bag rested on her shoulder. Inside the bags were boxes. Inside the boxes were shoes. A lot of shoes. She reached the car and set the bags carefully in the passenger seat. Then climbed in and stared at them for a moment. 2 pairs of Nike sneakers. A pair of bright white running shoes. Black high-top Nikes she had wanted for months. 3 pairs of Skechers. Comfort shoes. Slip-ons. And a pair of surprisingly stylish Skechers boots. Melissa started, laughing. 8 pairs. She shook her head. 8 pairs of shoes. She had never done anything like this before. Her whole life had been about stretching money, budgeting, planning, making sure the kids had what they needed. But today, for the first time in years, she bought things, simply because she wanted them. When Troy arrived later that evening, she opened the door and pointed immediately at the floor. "Don't judge me." Troy stepped inside, then stopped. 8 shoeboxes lined the wall near the couch. Troy whistled. "Well, damn." Melissa crossed her arms. "I know." "You had fun, though." Melissa nodded slowly. "Yeah." Then she sighed. "But I also feel a little bad." Troy walked over and picked up one of the boxes. "Why?" "Because it's ridiculous." Troy opened the lid. White Nike sneakers. Clean. Perfect. "Maybe," he said. "But you spent your whole life being responsible." Melissa smiled slightly. "True." Chaos. The dog lifted his head from the floor. Watching quietly as Troy stacked the boxes, Melissa laughed again. "I mean, seriously, when am I going to wear 8 different pairs of shoes?" Troy shrugged. "Whenever you want." That night, Troy texted Brian, "Come over tomorrow." Brian replied almost immediately. "Bring beer?" "Bring beer." The next afternoon, Brian pulled into Troy's driveway again. The Corvette still sat there. Brian shook his head. "Still ridiculous." Troy opened the garage door. "Get in here." The smell of charcoal filled the air. Troy had the grill going, steaks sizzling. Brian set a cooler down. Beer delivery. They cracked open the first cans while the grill popped and smoked. "Man, I missed this," Brian said. "Just hanging out." Troy nodded. Same. They ate outside, talking about old stories, old concerts, old girlfriends. After dinner, they moved inside. Brian grabbed a controller and tossed one to Troy. "What are we playing?" "NBA 2K. Brian grinned. "Oh, you're going down." 2 hours later, empty beer cans covered the coffee table. Brian had just lost another game. "This game is cheating." Troy laughed. "You just suck." Brian leaned back and stretched. "Man, I needed this." Troy stood up and walked into the kitchen. When he came back, he was holding something else. A glass bong. Brian raised an eyebrow. "Well, look at you," Troy grinned. "You want a hit?" "Absolutely." They sat back on the couch, passing the bong back and forth while the game menu music played quietly on the television. The room relaxed. The conversation slowed. Eventually, Brian looked around the house again. "Dude," Troy glanced at him. "What? You still haven't explained any of this." Troy smirked. "Explained what?" Brian waved his hand around the room. "The car, the guitars, the money." Brian leaned forward. "You tipped a stripper $1,000. You bought Melissa a diamond necklace. You bought your brother a damn Wembanyama rookie auto." Brian paused. "You're a printing press operator." Troy said nothing. Brian nodded slowly. "Exactly." The room went quiet. Troy took another hit from the bong, then set it down. "You really want to know?" Brian shrugged. "Yeah." Troy leaned back on the couch. "I print it." Brian blinked. "What?" "Money." Brian stared at him. "Like, no, counterfeit?" Brian sat there silently for several seconds, then laughed. "That's insane." Troy shrugged. "Maybe." Brian leaned back. "But also kind of genius." Troy smiled slightly. "Exactly." Brian rubbed his face. "How much?" "About 80,000 right now." Brian's eyes widened. "Holy hell, He leaned forward again. Wait, you're serious? Yeah. Brian sat there thinking. Then he nodded slowly. You know something crazy? What? My sister might actually know someone who could move that. Troy raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Brian took a drink. My sister Chandra. She's dating this guy. What guy? Brian shrugged. Name's Jesse. Kind of a street guy. Moves product. Moves cash. Brian looked at Troy. If you're sitting on piles of fake money, and someone like him might know how to move it, Troy leaned back, thinking, because for the first time, the idea of selling the money suddenly felt real. Across town, Melissa sat on the couch staring at her shoeboxes again. She smiled, but something about it still felt strange, because life had changed very quickly. And part of her wondered how long it could stay this good. Back at Troy's house, the conversation had shifted. Brian leaned forward. So what's the plan now? Troy looked toward the kitchen cabinet, then back at Brian. I guess the circle grows. Brian didn't say much for the first minute after Troy told him. He just sat there on the couch, holding the beer bottle loosely in one hand, staring at the paused video game screen like the answer might be hidden somewhere inside it. Finally, he looked over. So let me get this straight. Troy leaned back. Okay. You're printing counterfeit money. Yes. At the print shop. Yes. And it's good enough that people take. So far, Brian let out a slow breath and laughed once. That is one of the craziest things I've ever heard. Troy smiled faintly. You already said that. Yeah, well, it's still true. Brian picked up the bong, turned it in his hands, then set it back down without taking a hit. How long? A while. How much have you moved? Enough. Brian looked at him sharply. No vague answers now. You already told me the big part. Troy thought for a second, then shrugged. Me and Melissa have been spending it small. Stores, restaurants, gas, bills, little stuff. Brian nodded slowly. And you've really got 80 grand sitting around? About that. Brian laughed again, but there was less humor in it now. Man. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. This is not some little side hustle. I know. No, I mean, really no. Troy looked at him, but said nothing. Brian shook his head. You always were the smartest guy in the room. But smart doesn't mean bulletproof. Troy smirked. Did Jason teach you that line? No. Life did. The room went quiet again. The only sound was the low menu music from the television and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Brian broke the silence first. So Chandra. Troy raised an eyebrow. What about her? Brian took a drink. She doesn't know anything. And she's not the type I'd tell. Okay. But her boyfriend? Troy waited. Jesse's a different story. Brian scratched at the label on the beer bottle while thinking about how to explain it. He's one of those guys who always seems like he's halfway between lucky and dead. Troy smiled slightly. That's reassuring. I'm serious, Brian said. He's not stupid, just reckless, loud sometimes, emotional. But connected. Connected how? He moves stuff, knows people who move stuff. Cash, weed, pills, whatever. Street money. Troy leaned back deeper into the couch. And you think he'd buy money? Brian shrugged. I think he'd at least understand why someone would. Troy looked toward the kitchen for a second. The cabinet, the envelopes, the stacks. So you're saying he might be useful? Brian nodded. But that doesn't mean safe. That word stayed in the room for a moment. Safe. Nothing about any of this was safe anymore. Troy stood up and walked into the kitchen. Brian followed a few seconds later. Troy opened the cabinet and pulled out one envelope, then another, then another. Brian's expression changed as he watched the stacks land on the table. Jesus! Troy opened one envelope and fanned the bills slightly. They're clean. Brian picked one up carefully, turned it over, rubbed the paper between his fingers. Held it up to the light. His face shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Damn, yeah, this is good. I know, I mean really good. Brian looked up. If I didn't know, I wouldn't know. Troy nodded once. That's the point. Brian placed the bill back down slowly. Then he looked around the kitchen, suddenly aware of how strange the whole moment was. Suburban house, quiet night, stacks of counterfeit cash on the table, two middle-aged guys in a kitchen like they were discussing fantasy football. Brian laughed under his breath. "What?" "Nothing," Brian said. "Just, life is weird." Troy smiled. "That it is." Brian left about half an hour later. At the door he paused. "Want my honest opinion?" "Not really. Tough." Troy smiled. Brian looked serious now. "If you do this Jesse thing, you don't go in stupid, you don't go in eager, you don't flash all this, and you don't act like you're the smartest guy in the room." Troy nodded slightly. "That's fair." Brian put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm in your corner. But that doesn't mean I think this ends well." Then he left. Troy stood in the doorway watching Brian's truck pull away. The circle had grown. And once a secret started spreading, it never really belonged only to one person again. 2 days later, Melissa stood in the middle of the bedroom, surrounded by shoeboxes. Nike cashers. More than she needed, and fewer than she wanted to admit. She slipped on a second pair of white sneakers and looked in the mirror. Troy leaned against the doorway, smiling. "You happy?" Melissa looked down at the shoes and laughed. "Yes." Then the laugh softened, and also kind of guilty. "Why?" "Because no one needs this many shoes," Troy shrugged. "No one needs cable either." "That is not the same thing." "It kind of is." Melissa sat on the edge of the bed. "I had fun." "That's enough." She looked up at him. "You really think that?" "Yes." Melissa studied him carefully. "That's the difference between us right now." Troy frowned. "What do you mean?" "I can still feel bad." He smiled faintly. "That just means you're normal." "And you?" Troy didn't answer. Because lately he wasn't sure. The spending got more expensive that week. Not wildly reckless, but clearly different than before. Melissa bought perfume and another necklace. Troy bought a vintage guitar pedal he absolutely did not need, and a signed framed photo from a sports shop. They went out for steak twice in 1 week. Troy paid cash both times. He liked the weight of it, liked peeling bills from a stack. Liked the tiny pause in a waiter's face when the tip was huge, Melissa noticed. "You keep doing that." "What?" "Enjoying being seen." Troy smiled. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He looked out the car window and said nothing. Because she was right. He did enjoy it. He enjoyed the feeling of walking into a room with money and walking out having bent that room slightly in his favor. That feeling was new and dangerous. Kitty's laundromat smelled like detergent and warm metal. Rows of washers churned steadily while dryers thumped in the background like a tired mechanical heartbeat. Troy stood near the folding counter, watching bills slide from one customer's hand to Kitty's and then disappear into the register. Cash business. Steady business. The kind of place he had thought might help. The kind of place that had refused him. Kitty looked up from a stack of folded towels. "You keep showing up here, and people are going to think you really love laundry." Troy smiled. "Maybe I do." Kitty gave him a flat look. "You don't." He laughed quietly and walked over. Kitty had known something was wrong the first time he hinted around the edges of it. Since then, she knew enough. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to worry. "How bad is it now?" she asked. Troy leaned on the counter. "What makes you think it's bad?" "Because you have that face." "What face?" "The one you get when your life starts getting bigger than your plan." He laughed. "That's specific, huh?" Kitty nodded. "Troy, I own a laundromat. I watch people all day. Everyone tells on themselves eventually." He looked down. "Bigger than I expected." She folded another towel. "How much bigger?" He hesitated. "Then, a lot." Kitty stopped folding. "That's not a number." "No." "That means it's a bad number." "Probably." She sighed. "You stop yet?" "No." "Troy." "No." Kitty looked at him for a long second. "I know you think this is still about money." He frowned. "What else would it be about?" She set the towel down. "Power. Momentum. The feeling that you're finally beating something." The words bothered him because they were too close to the truth. "I'm just trying to live better." Kitty gave him a sad half smile. That was probably true once. He didn't answer. Customers moved behind them. A woman scooped warm clothes into a basket. Someone fed more quarters into a machine. The laundromat kept going. Small, clean, ordinary life. Continuing around a conversation that was anything but ordinary, Kitty lowered her voice. How many people know? Troy hesitated. Melissa. Kitty nodded. Obviously, Brian. Her expression changed slightly. You told Brian? Yeah. Kitty looked away for a second. That's how it starts. What? The expansion. He frowned. I trust him. That's not what I mean. Kitty leaned closer. The more people who know, the less control you have, even if they love you. Even if they mean well. Troy looked down at the counter. Brian knows. Melissa knows. Kitty knows. The circle. The title forming in his life before it ever formed in the story. I know, he said quietly. Kitty studied him. No, I don't think you do. He straightened. You think I'm in over my head. I think you stopped asking that question a long time ago. That irritated him because part of him knew it was true. I came here to talk, not get judged. Kitty's face softened. I'm not judging you. Could have fooled me. I'm scared for you. That shut him up. Kitty rarely said things like that so directly. She exhaled and picked up the towel again. I care about you, Troy. That's why I'm saying it. He nodded once. After a moment, she added, and for what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't drag me into it. Troy smiled faintly. Me too. He left a few minutes later feeling worse, not better. Kitty had a way of making the truth sound simple, and simple truths were hard to escape. That night, Melissa played music while cleaning up the kitchen. An old R&B track floated through the apartment, warm and smooth. Troy sat at the table watching her move. She always changed the mood of her room without seeming to try. What? She asked without turning around. Nothing. You're staring. I'm thinking. Melissa laughed softly. That again, he smiled. I talked to Kitty. She turned around then. And? She knows enough. Melissa dried her hands on a towel. How'd she take it? About as well as expected. Meaning? She told me I'm in over my head. Melissa walked over and sat down. That's because you are, Troy laughed. You too? I'm serious. She looked at him carefully. I'm with you. That's not changing. But don't confuse loyalty with blindness. He leaned back in the chair. Brian mentioned someone, Jesse. Yeah, Melissa made a face. I don't like the sound of that already. You've never met him. I don't need to. Guys named Jesse who move products are never a calm influence. Troy laughed. That's fair, she pointed at him. And don't laugh like it's funny. It is a little funny. It's not. The room went quiet, music still playing softly behind them. Melissa finally said, If you do this, it changes everything. He looked at her. Everything already changed. She held his gaze. No, bigger than this, and he knew she was right. Selling directly into that world was not the same as buying shoes and guitars and dinners and pretending the whole thing might stay domestic. That step would make the operation criminal in a more obvious, irreversible way. It would also solve his biggest problem. By the weekend, Troy had printed another batch, not because he needed to, because stopping now felt unnatural. The printer at the shop responded perfectly. The paper fed clean. The ink laid down exactly as he wanted. The bills came out sharp and dangerous and beautiful, in a way that only he would ever really appreciate. He counted the new stack alone under the warehouse lights, 9,000. He didn't smile this time, he only stared. Because there was no joy left in the mechanics of it, only scale. He tucked the stack into an envelope and stood there in the darkened print room listening to the cooling machines tick and settle. Then he realized something unsettling. He no longer printed money because it thrilled him. He printed it because the operation required it. That was different. That meant habit. And habit could be harder to break than temptation. Sunday afternoon, Brian called. Troy answered on the second ring. What's up? You busy? Not really. Come out back. Troy stepped onto his patio and looked around before realizing Brian meant his own place. Not Troy's. 45 minutes later, he pulled into Brian's driveway in Mansfield. Brian was outside by a fire pit with 2 lawn chairs and a cooler. Took you long enough, Brian said. Troy sat down. You said come out back like I was psychic. Brian laughed. Fair point. He handed Troy a beer. For a few minutes, they talked about nothing. The NBA. A bad YouTube ad Brian couldn't stop getting. A drum plug-in Chandra's ex had once tried to sell him. Then, Brian got quiet. Chandra called me, he said. Troy looked over. About what? Nothing major. Just family stuff. But Jesse was around. Troy waited. Brian stared into the fire pit. I asked a few careful questions. Troy's expression changed. Brian. What? You didn't say anything stupid. Did you? No. Did you? Brian shook his head. I'm not an idiot. Troy relaxed slightly. What'd you ask? Just general stuff. How he moves cash, how paranoid he is, if he's the type to talk. And? Brian took a drink. He's exactly what I thought. Which means useful, dangerous, impulsive, connected. Troy leaned back. Sounds perfect. Brian snorted. It sounds like a problem you might need. That line stayed in the air for a second. Then Brian added, he's got that kind of personality where one minute he's joking and the next minute he's ready to punch a hole in a wall. But he's not dumb. Not really. Troy said nothing, because he was already building the shape of Jesse in his mind. Not a person yet. A possibility. A conduit. A risk. Brian looked at him. You're really going to do this, aren't you? Troy stared ahead at the yard. Yes. Brian nodded slowly, like he had known the answer before asking. Then at least be smart enough to move slow. I will. Brian gave him a look that clearly said he didn't fully believe that. Before Troy left, Brian said one more thing. Chandra doesn't know anything, and I want to keep it that way. Troy nodded. Agreed. But Jesse eventually might. Troy looked at him. Yeah. Brian looked back toward the fire pit. And if that happens, we're not in our world anymore. That was the cleanest way anyone had said it. Not our world. Because up to now, Troy had still been moving through familiar spaces. The print shop, Melissa's apartment, stores, restaurants, banks. Even the strip club had still felt like part of ordinary city life. Jesse would be different. Jesse would belong to the part of the city where money, drugs, violence, and opportunity overlapped. And once Troy stepped into that, there would be no pretending he was just a frustrated guy who found a clever hustle. He would be something else. That night, Melissa found him in the kitchen again. Staring at the cabinet. You do that a lot now, she said. He glanced back. What? Stand there like it's talking to you. Troy smiled faintly. Maybe it is. Melissa walked over and leaned against the counter beside him. Brian? Yeah. And? He thinks Jesse could move it. Melissa closed her eyes for a second. So this is real now. It was already real. No, she said softly. This is different. She was right, of course. The cabinet no longer represented secret money. It represented choices, expanding choices, darkening choices. He opened the door and looked at the envelopes again. Melissa looked too. There was no excitement in her face now, only awareness. You know what scares me? She asked. What? That this all still feels fixable to you. He looked at her. And to you? Melissa stared at the money. No, she said. To me, it feels like gravity. That line stayed with him long after she went home. Gravity. Because that was exactly what it felt like. Not a decision anymore. Not really. A pull. A force. Something gathering strength with every day and every dollar and every person who learned even part of the truth. Troy sat at the table and did the math again. Not because he needed to. Because numbers soothed him. The total kept climbing. The spending couldn't keep pace. The batches were larger. The paper trail at work was getting harder to ignore. Ed was noticing patterns. Donna was asking Lisa questions. Kitty was worried. Brian was involved now. And Jesse existed like a door not yet opened. He sat there with the legal pad in front of him and wrote down the names of the people who knew. Melissa, Kitty, Brian. Then he added one more line. Jason? He stared at that question mark for a long time, because his brother would have to know eventually. Not yet. But soon. The circle really was growing. And the bigger it got, the less this felt like a secret, and the more it felt like a living thing moving outward on its own. Troy tore the page off the pad, folded it once, and dropped it into the trash. Then he turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, the cabinet looked ordinary again, just wood and hinges and paint. Nothing about it suggested the pressure hidden inside. Nothing about it suggested the city beginning to rearrange itself around one man's bad idea. Troy stood there for another few seconds before heading to bed. He already knew what came next, not exactly the details, but the direction. Jesse, Jason, bigger money, bigger risk, and all of it building towards something he no longer knew how to stop.